Let me clear something up before we start, because it's going to wreck a few history documentaries in your head. Ancient humans did not drop dead at 30 like clockwork, crumbling into dust the moment they hit their fourth decade. That number you've heard 1,000 times, average life expectancy was 30, is technically true and almost completely misleading at the same time. It's one of the great statistical illusions of history, and once you understand why, you'll never look at those old life expectancy charts the same way again. So let's actually dig into what killed ancient people, why the average was so low, and why some of them were out here living into their 70s while surrounded by all of that. Picture a small village a few thousand years ago. A woman has 10 children over her lifetime. 4 of them die before their first birthday. 1 more dies at age 6 from a fever nobody could name. That leaves 5 who survive childhood. Those 5 might live into their 50s, 60s, even 70s. But when you average all 10 lifespans together, the infants who lived 4 days and the elders who lived 70 years, you get a number sitting somewhere around 30. That's your headline statistic. That's the cavemen died at 30 myth, and it's built almost entirely on the backs of dead babies, not dead adults. This is called the arithmetic of averages doing something sneaky, and it's the single biggest reason people misunderstand ancient life. Child mortality was catastrophic. In many prehistoric and even early historic populations, something like a third to half of all children died before reaching age 15. That's not a typo. Half. Flip a coin, and if it lands wrong, that's the child not making it to their teenage years. When you fold numbers like that into an average, they drag the whole thing down into the basement, even if plenty of adults were shuffling around well into old age. Anthropologists actually have a term for the number that matters more: life expectancy at 15. If you take everyone who survived to their teenage years and ask how much longer they typically lived, the number jumps dramatically, often into the 50s or 60s. Survive the gauntlet of childhood, and your odds got a whole lot better. So the real question isn't why did ancient humans die young, it's why was childhood such a killing field, and then separately, what eventually got the adults who made it past that? Let's start with that killing field, because it explains most of the low numbers on its own. Childbirth itself was a battlefield, for both mother and infant. No antibiotics, no sterile instruments, no understanding of germs at all. For most of human history, nobody even knew bacteria existed, let alone that washing your hands mattered. A birth that today would be a routine, if uncomfortable, hospital visit could become a death sentence from something as simple as an infection after delivery. Obstructed labor, hemorrhaging, infection. These were common causes of death for young women, and it meant a huge chunk of the female population never got the chance to grow old in the first place. Some archaeologists estimate that maternal mortality in certain ancient populations rivaled the death rates we now associate with major surgery gone wrong, except it was happening in a hut or a cave with someone's grandmother as the only medical staff on hand. For the babies who survived birth, infancy was its own obstacle course. No formula if breastfeeding failed, no pasteurization, so contaminated milk or water could carry deadly bacteria straight into a newborn's fragile system. No vaccines against anything, not measles, not smallpox, not whooping cough, not diphtheria. These are diseases we basically forgot existed because vaccines made them irrelevant, but for most of human history they tore through populations, and children's immune systems, still developing, were the most vulnerable targets in the room. Then there's something people rarely think about: weaning. The moment a toddler stopped nursing and started eating regular food was one of the most dangerous transitions in ancient childhood. Breast milk provides antibodies and nutrition in a near-perfect package. Once that stopped, kids were exposed to contaminated food and water sources, and their nutrition often took a hit too, especially in societies where food was seasonal or scarce. Malnutrition didn't just starve kids outright, it weakened their immune systems so that a common cold could spiral into pneumonia, and a stomach bug could spiral into fatal dehydration. Speaking of dehydration, diarrheal disease might be the most underrated killer in all of human history. It sounds almost like a joke today, something you'd complain about after eating bad shellfish. But in a world without clean water, oral rehydration therapy, or basic sanitation, a severe bout of dysentery could kill a healthy adult in days and a child in hours. Entire archaeological sites show spikes in child burials that correlate with contaminated water sources or seasonal flooding, which tells you everything about how something we now treat with a sports drink and a lie down used to be an executioner. Now let's zoom out from childhood and talk about the adults, because they weren't exactly cruising through a spa retreat either. Violence was a constant companion. Not necessarily war in the organized, uniformed sense you picture from later history, but the smaller, grinding kind, raids between groups competing for land and resources, personal disputes that escalated because there was no police force, no courts, no real mechanism for de escalation beyond settle it yourselves. Skeletal remains from many prehistoric sites show a startling frequency of trauma: healed fractures, skull injuries, arrowheads embedded in bone. Some estimates suggest that in certain prehistoric populations, violent death accounted for a significant chunk of adult male mortality, numbers that would look like a war zone by modern standards, except this was just a Tuesday. And here's the brutal part: even minor injuries could turn fatal. You break your leg today, you get a cast, maybe some physical therapy, and you're back on your feet in weeks. Break your leg 20,000 years ago, and you're facing a real chance of infection setting into the wound, or the inability to hunt and gather food while you healed, which could mean starvation before the bone even had a chance to knit back together. A twisted ankle wasn't an inconvenience. It could be a slow death sentence if it happened at the wrong time, in the wrong place. Even something as small as a dislocated shoulder could tip a hunter from provider to liability within a single afternoon, and in a small band with limited surplus food, that shift mattered more than it would today. Infections in general were a nightmare across the board. A scraped knee, a splinter, a tooth abscess. Things we treat with a tube of antibiotic ointment or a 5-day course of pills could, without any way to fight bacteria, spread into sepsis and kill a person within a week. This is honestly one of the hardest things for modern people to internalize. We live in a world so saturated with antimicrobial medicine that we forget infection used to be one of the top killers of humanity. Full stop, no qualifiers needed. Let's talk teeth for a second, because dental problems are a surprisingly big piece of this puzzle. Ancient diets, especially after the invention of agriculture, were rough on teeth. Gritty stone-ground grain wore enamel down fast, and sugars from fruit or honey caused cavities with nothing resembling dental care to fix them. An abscessed tooth sounds like a minor annoyance you'd handle with a dentist appointment today. Back then, that infection sat right next to your brain and your bloodstream with absolutely nothing standing in its way. Multiple historical and archaeological records point to dental infections as a legitimate cause of death, which is a wild thing to picture, dying from a toothache. Parasites deserve their own mention too, because they were everywhere. Tapeworms, roundworms, lice, fleas, carrying disease. These weren't occasional visitors. They were basically permanent roommates for huge swaths of ancient populations. Chronic parasitic infection doesn't always kill directly, but it drains the body, causes anemia, weakens immune defenses, and stunts growth in children. It's death by 1,000 tiny cuts, except the cuts are worms living in your intestines, siphoning off your nutrition while you try to survive on food that was already scarce. And then there's famine, the slow, grinding killer that doesn't show up dramatically in a single skeleton, but shows up everywhere in the population data. Ancient food supplies were fragile. A bad harvest, an unusually harsh winter, a drought, any of these could tip a community from getting by into outright starvation. Malnutrition rarely killed people outright and directly. Instead, it acted as an accomplice, weakening bodies just enough that the next disease, the next infection, the next hard winter finished the job. Bones from famine periods often show growth arrest lines, essentially scars in the skeleton that record moments where the body stopped growing because it simply didn't have the resources to. Weather and climate volatility deserve some attention too, because ancient humans had almost no buffer against a bad season. No refrigeration to store surplus for years, no global trade network to import food when the local harvest failed. A single unusually cold winter could wipe out stored grain, kill livestock, and leave a community with nothing to fall back on until spring. Ice core and tree ring data have let researchers reconstruct some of these climate shocks, and time and again, spikes in mortality line up neatly with years when the weather simply refused to cooperate. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Now here's where the story gets more interesting, because I promised you earlier that plenty of ancient people did survive into old age, and that's absolutely true. Once someone made it past the brutal gauntlet of childhood, avoided death in childbirth, dodged violent conflict, and managed to survive the constant background hum of infection and famine, their odds of reaching 60, 70, even beyond were genuinely decent. We know this from something researchers call the grandmother hypothesis, the idea that older women, past their own reproductive years, played a crucial role in the survival of their grandchildren by helping gather food and pass down knowledge. If elderly humans were just useless dead weight who never existed in meaningful numbers, this entire evolutionary theory wouldn't hold together. Grandparents were common enough and valuable enough to shape human social structures. Skeletal analysis backs this up too. Archaeologists regularly find remains showing signs of advanced age, worn joints consistent with decades of arthritis, evidence of tooth loss that happened so long before death that the jawbone had time to remodel around it, healed injuries from earlier in life that show a body which kept functioning for years afterward. These aren't rare anomalies buried in a footnote. They show up across sites and across eras, painting a picture of a population where old age, while not the norm statistically, was absolutely achievable biologically. There's actually a fascinating example that gets brought up constantly in this discussion, a Neanderthal skeleton found decades ago, showing an individual who lived to what would have been a genuinely old age for his time, missing teeth, riddled with arthritis, clearly unable to hunt or fend for himself in his final years. And yet he survived anyway. That means someone was taking care of him, feeding him, protecting him, even deep in prehistory among a species we sometimes still stereotype as brutish. There was enough social structure and enough compassion to keep a disabled elder alive well past the point where nature alone would have finished him off. That single skeleton tells you more about ancient humanity than 100 statistics ever could. So why does the "everyone died at 30" myth persist so stubbornly? Part of it is just how statistics get misused in casual conversation. Nobody stops to ask, wait, is this an average? And if so, what's dragging it down? Part of it is that dramatic imagery sells better than nuance. A caveman clutching his chest and collapsing at 30 makes for a punchier documentary narration than actually it's complicated and depends heavily on which age bracket you survived into. And part of it is a kind of chronological smugness we all fall into sometimes. This quiet assumption that people in the past were somehow more fragile, more primitive, more doomed than us, when in reality their bodies were exactly as capable as ours. They were just operating without the safety net of modern medicine, sanitation, and food security that we take for granted every single day without even thinking about it. Here's a thought experiment that really drives this home. Take a healthy modern adult, physically fit, no chronic conditions, and drop them into a hunter-gatherer band 20,000 years ago with none of their modern advantages. No antibiotics if they cut themselves, no vaccines, no dentist, no emergency surgery if their appendix decides to rupture. That person is not guaranteed to die at 30. If they avoid a violent encounter, avoid a bad infection, avoid childbirth complications if applicable, and manage to eat consistently, there's a real chance they live a long life. The danger was never really about age itself ticking up like a countdown timer. The danger was the sheer number of ways a normal, healthy life could be interrupted at any moment by things modern people simply never have to think about. And honestly, that reframes the whole question in a much more interesting way. It's not, why did ancient humans have some biological expiration date at 30? It's, how did any of them survive long enough to become our ancestors at all, given how many ways there were to die before your next birthday? Every single person alive today descends from an unbroken chain of ancestors who dodged childbirth complications, survived infancy, avoided fatal infections, escaped violent conflict, and outran famine, Generation after generation after generation. That's not a small thing. That's an unbroken streak of survival stretching back tens of thousands of years, and you are quite literally the current champion of that streak. Now, agriculture actually made a lot of this worse before it eventually made things better, which surprises people. When humans transitioned from hunting and gathering to farming, population density increased, and so did contact with domesticated animals. That's a recipe for new diseases jumping species. Plenty of historians and researchers point to this period as the beginning of major epidemic diseases becoming a persistent feature of human life. Things like measles and tuberculosis that likely originated from close contact with livestock. Settled agricultural communities also relied more heavily on a narrower range of crops, which meant nutrition sometimes got worse, not better, compared to the varied diet a hunter-gatherer might piece together from dozens of different wild food sources. Skeletal evidence from the shift to agriculture actually shows a measurable decrease in average height and an increase in markers of nutritional stress in a lot of populations. So in some very real ways, the advance of farming came with a mortality cost before humanity eventually figured out irrigation, crop rotation, and enough surplus food to stabilize things. City living, once it eventually arrived, brought its own fresh set of problems. Crowding people together in close quarters is fantastic for trade, culture, and innovation, and absolutely terrible for disease transmission. Ancient cities without sewage systems became breeding grounds for waterborne illness. Waste disposal was often as simple as tossing it into the street or the nearest river, the same river people were drinking from downstream. Some historians argue that early cities only maintained their populations at all because of constant migration from the countryside, since urban death rates were so high that the cities themselves were essentially population sinks, absorbing newcomers faster than they could replace their own dead. It's also worth mentioning how differently ancient societies handled disability and chronic illness compared to how we might assume. There's a persistent stereotype that ancient life was some kind of ruthless survival of the fittest arena where anyone who couldn't contribute was left behind. But archaeological evidence keeps contradicting that. Beyond that arthritic elder skeleton I mentioned earlier, there are numerous examples across different eras and regions of individuals with significant physical impairments, limb differences, severe old age frailty, healed injuries that would have left someone unable to walk properly, who nonetheless lived for years after their condition set in. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because a community made a decision over and over to keep feeding and protecting someone who could no longer fully provide for themselves. Ancient humans, it turns out, were a lot more like us emotionally than the grunting caveman stereotype gives them credit for. There's also a strange kind of comfort in how much ancient people understood about their own mortality, even without modern science to explain the mechanisms behind it. Many ancient burial practices show clear evidence of ritual, grief, and care. Grave goods placed with the dead, bodies arranged deliberately rather than dumped, sometimes flowers or pigments found in burial sites thousands of years old. These weren't people who shrugged off death as a routine background noise of existence. They mourned. They ritualized loss. They tried, in whatever ways their culture allowed, to make sense of why someone they loved didn't make it to see another season. That's not so different from what we do now, just without the greeting cards and the funeral homes. So let's tie this all together. Ancient humans did not have some biological switch that flipped off at age 30. What they had was an environment absolutely stacked with hazards concentrated most heavily in childhood and around childbirth, hazards we've almost completely eliminated in the modern developed world through vaccines, sanitation, antibiotics, and medical care that would have looked like pure magic to anyone living before the 20th century. The famous life expectancy of 30 statistic is real, but it's a mathematical average dragged down by devastating infant and child mortality, not evidence that adults were dropping like flies the moment they hit their 30th birthday. Survive childhood, survive childbirth if you were giving birth. Dodge violence, dodge infection, dodge famine, and your odds of reaching old age were genuinely solid. Solid enough to build entire evolutionary theories around the value of grandparents. Solid enough to leave behind skeletons riddled with the evidence of decades more life after injuries that should have been fatal. Solid enough that a disabled elder could be kept alive by his community for years after he could no longer hunt or forage for himself. The real story of ancient mortality isn't a tale of universal early death. It's a story about how brutally unforgiving the early years of life were, how many quiet, invisible killers lurked in things we now consider trivial like a scraped knee or a bad tooth, and how remarkably resilient and cooperative ancient humans had to be just to keep their communities alive generation after generation. Every time you get a vaccine, every time you take an antibiotic for an infection, every time you drink water straight from a tap without a second thought about whether it'll give you a fatal case of dysentery, you're benefiting from thousands of years of humanity slowly, painfully closing the gaps that used to cut lives short. Ancient humans weren't fragile. They weren't doomed. They were playing the exact same game we're playing now, trying to survive, trying to protect the people they loved, trying to make it to old age, except they were playing it on the hardest difficulty setting imaginable, with none of the tools we now consider basic human rights. And somehow, against all those odds stacked up one on top of another, enough of them made it through anyway to become the reason any of us are here at all. Next time someone tells you cavemen were basically walking corpses by 30, you'll know exactly which statistic they're misreading, and exactly how many grandmothers, healers, and stubborn survivors it took to get you here in the first place.